Some of you might remember this about me, while some others might have forgotten. But I did not grow up in a disciples church. I grew up in a Lutheran church in my hometown of Kendallville, Indiana, which is about an hour and a half away from Wabash. Very similar to Wabash in small town atmosphere. Now, I come from a long line of German Lutherans. We went to church probably every other Sunday, but other than that, we really didn't do much else in regards to church life. The church we attended was the church that my grandparents attended and got married in, the one my parents got married in, and eventually my sister. Although I no longer identify myself as a Lutheran, in some ways that church is my home church. Because it's in my hometown, and it's a church you can say that I grew up in. With that being said, I know a lot of the people in that church know that I'm a pastor. It's a couple of hundred people in that church. Maybe they do, but I'm not quite sure. There are times when I think about what it would be like if I were to give a sermon in front of that church, that congregation. Now, I've not either been asked or offered to, but I wonder how those in the crowd would receive me, or even if they would recognize me. I imagine this is probably similar to what he felt like when he was about to enter his hometown and his home synagogue and our scripture passage for today. In the chapters before Mark 6, the reader and hearer of the story has been made aware of the many wonderful acts of healing and compassion that took place at the hands of Jesus. So much so that Jesus was able to gather a royal following of disciples and a crowd of many others who followed him from here to there and everywhere he went. There's always a crowd with Jesus, you can guarantee that. However, when we get to the scripture passage today, events come to a halt and take a turn in the opposite direction. Jesus traveled a lot, and it shouldn't surprise us that he would make a stop at his hometown. It's so easy for us to forget that Jesus had an earthly family and an earthly life. We're often so concentrated on the godly and extraordinary characteristics of Jesus that we forget he was born to a mother like we were. And for all that we know, Jesus had a childhood that wasn't altogether that different from ours. He probably played with the same group of neighborhood kids every week. Probably got yelled at by his parents and others when he misbehaved. Maybe he got grounded. He probably had meals with his family gathered around the kitchen table on a regular basis. He probably had an extended family that lived close by whom he visited often. Yep, he probably lived in a small town like Wabash, where everybody knows everybody. In our scripture, Jesus was returning to that place, to those precious memories. He was returning there after he had received some notoriety and fame. Now, we don't know what Jesus was thinking or feeling before he returned to his homeland. But there was probably a mixture of excitement and also hesitation. Excitement because he was going to see family and friends he hadn't seen in a while. Excitement because he was probably reliving some wonderful memories of his past. And there was probably hesitation. Because Jesus was a different person than when he lived there. Jesus had changed. He probably wasn't sure who he was going to run into when he was there. He might have thought, what will they think of the new me? Will they notice that change. So Jesus enters into his childhood synagogue and does what he does best: teach and preach to those in attendance. Now, what he was teaching, we do not know for sure, but odds are it was similar to what he had preached and taught in the towns before. Odds are that it was probably something that those in the crowd had not really heard before. Now, Jesus was good about doing that, giving a message that was entirely different from what people expected. I bet it was also a message that they desperately needed to hear. We know from our scripture that those who listened to him were astonished because of what they heard. But those in attendance who heard Jesus in his hometown, who had seen Jesus growing up before their very own eyes, were not astonished like those before. Those gathered in his hometown were not amazed by Jesus' compassion, his boldness to do what he felt God was calling him to do and be. Instead, they were astonished because of this man, who they remember as a little boy, whom they helped raise, said things they never thought they would hear from anyone, yet alone him. Scripture says that they were offended by him. Ouch. That's a little much. Being offended by Jesus, what Jesus had to say. Sure, people were offended by what he had to say, but his family, that's a completely different level. Now, because of their unfavorable and harsh reaction, Jesus could not continue in his hometown. He couldn't continue the great work he had done up until that point. He was only able to heal and cure a few sick people, and then he and his disciples were on their way. Jesus was taken aback by the whole way his family and friends had received him. And we can't really blame him. Maybe there was a part of him that wanted some kind of acknowledgement of what he was doing. Maybe he wanted some kind of affirmation from those who knew him back in the day that he was doing some really amazing things. Maybe he wanted to know that he was making them proud. But he received none of this. So he went on his way to the next place. After this event, Jesus continued to go and do in the name of God. And on top of this, he sent his disciples 2 by 2 to perform awesome acts of ministry and to tell others about Jesus and the amazing acts and services he was doing in God's name. But before they went, Jesus warned them to not take too much with them, only a staff and sandals. Other translations of this have Jesus tell the disciples to take nothing. Jesus tells his disciples that when they arrive at someone's house, that they should stay there until they leave. Now, the disciples were not told exactly what that means, but I'm sure Jesus trusted that they would know when that time had come. Jesus cautions the disciples that if anyone rejects them by not welcoming them into their house and are refusing to hear what they have to say, then they should dust off the dirt off their sandals at their door and leave and go elsewhere. Now, dusting the dirt off of one's sandals back in Jesus' time would be a sign of disgrace directed towards the person's home and their behavior. And we are told that the disciples did just this. They performed many acts of faith and service and healing, all in the name of God. In his vignette of stories, we are reminded of a different kind of Jesus. A humble, vulnerable man who wasn't being celebrated or honored or worshipped for what